Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Umber Studios. Welcome to another online portrait drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you 3 photographs on the screen, one for 10 minutes, one for 20 and one for 30, and it's your job to draw the image that you see. Lizet will be joining us today. She'll be doing a demonstration and giving hints and tips. You can either follow her advice or do your own thing. It's entirely up to you. Once it's finished, don't forget to post your photographs on Instagram and hashtag them with hashtag #RawUmberLive. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to the latest online portrait video. In this one I will be working on A4 cartridge paper. I will be using willow charcoal in a few different sizes, a grey putty rubber, and finally something to blend. So this could be a tissue, or maybe a Q-tip, or a little brush, or even your finger. You can find all the materials I'm using in the link below the video under materials. In the meantime, let's get started. In this session, I want to show the importance of light and dark shapes in a drawing. So the first thing I'm going to do is tone the paper using the side of my willow charcoal. You can then use a piece of tissue or a rag to even this out. And you can see I've now lightly toned the paper, but it might be useful to do it twice so you get a mid-tone grey. And what this gives us is the ability to put down darker shapes using the charcoal and pull out lighter shapes using the rubber. This same technique can also be applied using toned paper and white pastel to pull out the highlights. But in this drawing I chose white paper, as I think most people will have a piece of white A4 paper to hand. Okay, so let's get started with the drawing. First, I want to talk about some general proportions. The first and most important measurement to put down is the length of the face. You can choose to put this down anywhere on the paper. As you can see here, I'm making sure that it covers most of the paper. The next most important line is the center line, and this is the line going from the middle of the forehead to the middle of the chin. And this line is important because it indicates the tilt of the head. You can lay your pencil across that imaginary line to see the tilt and then simply copy it onto your paper. From here, I will put down some horizontal measurements that are usually true on any face. The first one is the midpoint. The midpoint is usually the middle of the corner of the eyes. Again, lay your pencil across the face to view the tilt of the eyes. It is also useful to see where the bottom of the nose and the hairline are located. In this case, I see them located about halfway towards the midpoint. Now we have these big vertical measurements in. We can use these to find the width of the face. In this case, I can see the width is the same as the bottom of the nose to the chin. So you can just lay your pencil across the image, compare it, and then take that same comparison on your drawing. And this is called comparative measurement. Now at the beginning of the video, I was saying I would like to explore shapes. A lot of people find it natural to draw using lines, but I want to do the exact opposite here. So I'm going to start looking for blocks of dark shapes. So instead of drawing that out with a line, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the side of my charcoal and I'm going to block it out. And what I'm looking for here are the big dark shapes on his face. So the hair is fairly obvious, but also have a look, for instance, at the side of his nose or the side of his face. And I'm really trying to see first the angles of the lines using the same technique that I used for the center line, and then I just block it in straight away. And you can use a piece of tissue for this if you want to blend it a bit more, or you could also use your finger or a stump, or you can leave it completely as is. I like to use a bit of tissue to blend it. This is called Flattening the Shadows, and the point of it is that it takes away all the texture out of the shadow, which means that your eye can focus on the shapes rather than on the textures. And when doing this, try to simplify the face into big geometric shapes. So it can be quite hard to draw the cheek, but if you imagine a light being one big triangle, it suddenly makes it a lot easier because everyone can draw a triangle. So the thing to imagine here is that the face is made up out of these interlocking light and dark shapes. So we have that triangle on the cheek interlocking with another triangle on the side of the nose. And this can be tricky to see at first, but once you get the hang of it, I think you'll see it can really improve your drawing. Of course, these shapes are very simplified, so when you want to break them down a bit more precisely, what I like to do is erase using my finger or a little brush. And this keeps the ground nice and grey, whereas if you use a rubber, this really takes the paper all the way back to white. For the eyes, they're very complicated shapes, so what I like to do is simplify them into big blocks first, much like what I did on the cheek, and then later go in and carve out the smaller shapes on top. For the mouth, I simplify it into one dark shape for the top lip and one dark shape for below the bottom lip. And you can see that slowly a face is starting to form. Now what I like to do here is go in with a Q-tip, again to make sure that the charcoal doesn't get erased completely, and I gently carve out the light shapes. So looking at the left eye, for instance, I use the Q-tip to gently carve out the shape for the lower lid and then reinstate very gently the shadow shape around it. And when you do that very quickly, you can see an eye starts to emerge. And at this point, you can even go in with the rubber and start carving out the highlights. We're almost at the end of the 10-minute pose, so I'm going to leave it here and I'm going to practice this again in a 20-minute pose. So for the 20-minute pose, I'm gonna start the same way as I did in the 10-minute pose by placing the top and bottom of the skull or the face on the paper. Then on top of that, I can place my center line and really make sure you look at the angle here because he is angled away. The center line will not be in the center of the face. Next, I'm gonna find the midpoint. And don't worry if you make a little mistake, you can simply blend that out into the background and then redo your strokes. And again, I see the bottom of the nose and the bottom of the hairline about halfway on each half of the face. And like I did in a 10-minute pose, now I have these big measurements in. I'm gonna take a look at the width of the face. Now the tricky part with a 3/4 head is that the side that is turned away is more narrow than the other side of the face. So really look at the measurement here, as it's easy to make it a bit too big. And I see it about half of the length of the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin. So half of a quarter of the length. Note that the outline will slope backwards towards the top of the head, that the widest point is the point of the cheekbone just below the eyes, and that the eye sockets recede into the head. Next, I'm putting in the angle of the bottom of the jawline, and note that I'm mostly using straight lines here, and this is to keep it easy to change and to see the angles. So now we have those measurements in, let's jump straight into the shadow shapes again. Starting with the brow line, I'm simplifying the eyes into one big block that I can later erase into. And I'm basically shading in the whole of the far away side of his face, with the exception of a little triangle underneath the eye on his cheekbone. Like I did in the 10-minute pose, I'm just simplifying the whole upper lip into a shadow shape. In the meantime, you can start seeing a face emerging. Make sure you sometimes measure your shadow shapes. So for instance here, when I'm figuring out where the hair starts, I'm looking at how many eyes would fit between the corner of his cheekbone and the corner of his eye. So just measuring out the angles and the shapes of this big block can really help with the drawing. And while I'm doing this, if you have any questions or something's not entirely clear, feel free to ask me in the comments. So now we are roughly where we left off during the 10-minute video. And in this case, I'm going to use a little brush and I'm going to push around the charcoal to make the shapes more accurate and to create smaller shapes within them. So for instance, for the eye, I'm using the brush to erase some of the lights near the nose, and then I use it to cut into my dark shape to get the top lid. And as you can see, slowly an eye starts to emerge. And I really like this way of working because it's very close to what you would do if you were painting. Because when you're painting, you have a big brush, you can't really work in line, you have to put big shapes of shadow or light or color down. So I'm now going to continue refining my shapes, working my way down the face. In the meantime, as I was saying earlier, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me in the comments. So now most of my shapes are in and I'm pretty happy with the general likeness and the placement of the features. Now what I can do next is take out my putty rubber, and I really recommend you get a grey putty rubber for this, but if you're using a white rubber, what you can do is slice off a wedge, and this wedge shape will have a very fine point, which is great for detail. And using this fine point, I'm going to start looking for light shapes. So I'm going to do exactly the same as I did for the shadow shapes, but now of course from the opposite side of the value spectrum. So instead of looking at where the big dark shapes are, I'm going to be looking at where the big light shapes are. For instance, I see a light shape just below his eye, and I see a big highlight on his cheekbone. And for instance, on the edge of the nose. And the important thing to remember about these light shapes is that they are the opposite of the shadows. The shadow shapes are located where forms turn away and the light cannot reach, for instance, the side of his face. Whereas the light shapes are located on the corners of areas that are protruding towards us and the light source. So you can see, for instance, in the area where the nose is pointed most towards us, on that corner you can see a highlight. And when you do this, probably you will find that your drawing starts feeling a little bit 3D. The light shapes will feel like they are coming towards us, and the darks will feel like they're receding in space. So it's a really nice way to have a sense of form and a sense of reality in your drawing. One thing to note when you start working in the shadows is to never make them lighter. So for instance, the eye here, instead of making the white of the eye whiter, I'm going to add a darker accent for the iris of the eye. And this just ensures that the light still protrudes towards us and the dark still recedes. So for the rest of this 20-minute pose, I'm just going to continue to refine my dark and light shapes. And then I will see you at the 30-minute pose. So for the 30-minute pose, I'm going to start in exactly the same way. I've already given my paper a quick wash with the charcoal here, like I did in the 10 and the 20-minute pose. And then I'm going to start by placing the top and the bottom of the head on the paper. If you're working on a profile portrait like this one, it's useful to note that you can imagine the head being a box. So the width will be very, very similar to the height in terms of measurement. With a profile, what I like to do in order to find the start of the jawline is to draw a cross through all of the corners. And that midpoint of the cross will be the start of the jawline and the middle of the ear. When finding the bottom of the nose and the top of the brow, I see that they are located at 2/3 of the whole length of the pose. And once I've got these big measurements in, again, like I did in the 10 and 20-minute pose, I'm going to go straight in and start figuring out my big blocks of shadow. And imagine the angles going through here. So for instance, the corner of the eye to the corner of the nose has a shadow following along it, which has a certain angle. So it's useful to look at these big angles when you're doing these shadow shapes. For the mouth, what I usually end up doing is looking at 1/3. So the bottom 1/3 will be the bottom of the chin to the top of the chin. Then the middle third will be the top of the chin to the dividing line of the lips. And like I did in the other two poses, I'm just using a shadow shape for the top lip and a shadow shape underneath the bottom lip to figure out where they are located. And feel free to make big changes here. So for instance, if you see the forehead being further back, you can push it back quite far by just erasing using your fingers. Or you can make the forehead more straight. It's really easy to change the likeness using this method of shadow shapes. So now I've got most of my shapes in, I'm going to start introducing the hair. And once I'm happy with that, I can start refining my bigger shadow shapes. And you can use the side of your charcoal here to make a slightly more crisp edge, or you can use the brush, a Q-tip or your finger to gently carve out the shadow shapes. Just as a little side note, because of time constraints, I'm not drawing the hands in. I do have a hand-only drawing session that you can find in the archives if you have a subscription. But because we have only 30 minutes for the post, I want to really focus on just shapes only, and I leave it up to you if you want to draw the hand in or not. So I'm going to continue refining my shadow shapes here. For instance, with the eye, finding the shape for the brow and the shape of the top lid of the eye, and then carving out that light of the top lid. And really take your time here and allow yourself to really immerse yourself in this part of the drawing process. If these dark and light shapes are right, the face will really start to emerge. And only when I'm pretty happy with the overall likeness and the overall drawing, I start putting on my light shapes. When putting these light shapes on, make sure to use a very fine point if you're using a putty rubber, or a nice carved out wedge if you're using a white rubber. And this just helps with precision. So I'm now going to go around the portrait and I'm going to start finding places where I can put these highlights down. While I'm doing this, if you have any questions at all, I am in the chat if you're watching this live, so feel free to ask me anything. For the highlights in the hair, remember that of course the hair is a dark tone, so the highlights are not going to be quite as bright as those in the skin. So sure, make them a little bit lighter, but don't go any lighter than the tone of the paper. So don't use the rubber for them. Another note about drawing hair is that our instinct can be to draw every single hair individually, but something that can be really effective instead is to just look at the shape of the highlights and make that shape a little bit hairy, and our brains will fill in the rest of the information. Note that I haven't actually drawn an outline around any of the lights. So for instance, the top of the nose doesn't have an outline and the top of the bottom lip doesn't have an outline. And this can really help with the sense of reality in your drawing, because in real life it doesn't really have an outline either. What you can do to make it jump out a bit more is use your rubber to erase some of the background around the face. And doing this can really make your outlines nice and crisp. But of course you don't want this crispness everywhere, because then it will start looking a little bit cartoony. So the next thing to do is to look at your shapes and without changing anything inside of the shapes, to just vary the edge. So an obvious example here is the bottom of the hair. So that shouldn't be very crisp and clean. It should be a bit soft and have a ragged quality to it. And I like to drag my brush into the hair here, but there's loads of different techniques you can use. Another area of edge is inside of the skin. And because the skin is quite soft, those highlights will not have nice crisp borders. So another thing you can do is go in and vary the pressure of your rubber to make it feel like it blends into the rest of that grey halftone that we've put down at the start of the drawing. I've really ignored the little bits of hair coming in front of his eyes, but it's fairly easy to just put a few of those in by just dragging a piece of charcoal downwards. And that already gives a lot of indication in terms of the texture of the hair without having to put anything in the actual big shapes that we've put down. So I'm going to continue going around my dark shapes and looking at crisp edges versus soft edges. So for instance, the bottom of the nose can be quite crisp, whereas the top is a little bit more ambiguous. So I'm going to soften that up. Again, if you're looking at accents within the shadow, don't make them any lighter, but instead use a bit more pressure on your charcoal. You can even use compressed charcoal for this to put a darker accent within those shadows. And this ensures that your shadows stay nice and dark, and there's a clear division between that and the light. So for the rest of the pose, I'm just gonna go around my shapes and vary the edges of those shapes as much as I can. And then I will see you at the end of the pose. Okay, so this is the end of the 30-minute post and of the session. I hope that you've learned something and most importantly, enjoyed yourself in the process. Feel free to post your work using the hashtag #RawUmberLive if you use Instagram.
Thank you for taking part. I'd like to thank Lizet for joining us today as well. Don't forget to photograph your work, post them on Instagram and hashtag them with #RawUmberLive. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session every Wednesday at 8 p.m. and portrait drawing every Sunday at 4 p.m. You can find out more details on our website, rawumberstudios.com.